Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video explores an alternate version of events and characters in a reimagined storyline. This presentation is structured and adopted into an audiobook style format with narration and visuals to enhance the experience. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story.
This alternate universe story is written and narrated by Fantasy Reimagined. Chapter 55, A Dust That Remembers War. POV Citadel Meisters. In the dim light of the Citadel's northern wing, where sunlight rarely penetrated the high windows, the dust of centuries lay thick over the manuscripts. Each parchment held a fragment of memory, the toll of winters that stretched longer than men could endure, the whispers of armies who had never been seen, and the instruments used to strike them down. Archmaester Corwin lifted a brittle sheet, the edges curled like dying leaves, revealing a hand-drawn diagram of blades and stones that could pierce shadows. His eyes, clouded with age and careful study, traced the symbols of dragonglass, Valyrian steel, and fire. Not myth, but repeated practice recorded over generations. They feared, he murmured, but they acted. And action leaves traces, even when the world forgets. Debate erupted among the gathered scholars. "It is legend," said Master Alaric, his voice crisp, precise. "Stories exaggerated to frighten children and men alike. No army moves beyond the wall like this." Corwin shook his head slowly, fingers trembling over the parchment. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this is myth, but patterns endure. Every long winter, every whisper of frozen death, it is written here. The details differ, yet the outcomes converge. Knowledge must move faster than fear. That is our duty." Others shifted uneasily, the weight of responsibility pressing upon them. To declare the truth openly would destabilize kingdoms, cause panic among lords, and undermine the fragile peace that had survived Robert's rebellion, the rise and fall of kings, and the shifting power of houses. Yet silence, they realized, carried its own danger. If the North was left unprepared, if Jon or anyone else were to face the unseen army alone, the realm would pay the cost of their inaction. Discreetly, they began to compile copies. Each fragment, each account of prior long winters, each notation of weapons that could pierce the impossible was sent south and east. Ravens carried them to high houses, maesters abroad, and trusted scholars. The message was simple, coded, but undeniable. The dead had returned before, and the knowledge of how to fight them was not lost. It was remembered, if one had the patience to seek it. For nights, Corwin and his associates debated the framing of the copies. Should they claim certainty? Should they hedge with warnings and probabilities? They chose balance, each document annotated. "We cannot swear this will suffice, but history repeats in patterns. Those who ignore these signs do so at peril." It was not prophecy, nor sermon, nor call to arms. It was scholarship, and in the halls of the Citadel, where dust remembered war and ink preserved the fears of centuries, the truth began its slow journey into the world. Knowledge, they hoped, would arrive before panic. But even they feared it might not. Chapter 56. The library that no one wanted. POV Samwell Tarley. Sam had never seen the abandoned library like this. The halls of Castle Black's old records room were silent, the air heavy with damp paper and the faint tang of iron from past bloodshed. The books leaned against one another like tired sentinels, their spines cracked and pages brittle. This place had been ignored for decades, left to rot while rangers fought patrols and recruits learned to march on snow. And yet, in this decay lay a treasure. He moved quietly, mindful of the silence. He had learned patience at the wall, not only in battle but in thought. Each ledger, each account, was a whisper from the past. A night in which the cold did not obey men, in which shadows moved with intent, and in which lives were measured not in victories but in survival. The old watch logs were methodical, sometimes cruelly so, cataloging patrols lost to frost, sightings of creatures men had feared to name, and methods that had proven effective against them. Sam cross-referenced these with the reports arriving from the Citadel, corroborations and contradictions alike. Where the Citadel recorded patterns, the Watch recorded reality. Together, the fragments formed a more complete picture. Hours turned into days as he worked, copying fragments, organizing accounts, and drawing lines between them. Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, fire, old spells, and techniques, once considered superstitious, were noted. What worked, what failed, What the dead could not resist, everything was cataloged. The list grew, and with it, Sam's understanding of the threat. And yet, he said nothing. There was no triumph in discovery, no joy in knowledge. Truth was a burden. To announce it would be to force action prematurely, to put lives at risk before the world understood the scale of what approached. Instead, he prepared the records, organized them logically, and sent them with a raven, anonymously, urgently, to Jon. He included notes, but no commentary. Jon had seen the army beyond the wall he would understand without explanation. In the quiet of that decayed library, Sam felt the enormity of his role. He was not a hero of battle. He did not wield sword or strategy, but he held knowledge, and knowledge in the right hands could save thousands. Pride had no place here. Ego was a liability. Only the truth mattered. Preserved where it could survive, even when men did not. He paused, looking at a ledger describing a patrol lost its shadowed figures beyond the forest. One name, long forgotten, stared back at him from the page. Sam touched the ink lightly, and a shiver ran down his spine. These were not stories, they were warnings, and soon, very soon, the men who could act would need to act. By the end, Sam had assembled a comprehensive list, the weapons that could harm the dead, the methods that had succeeded, and the evidence that corroborated them across centuries. He tied them together with care, ensuring Jon would receive them not as a scholar's speculation, but as documented truth. The library remained silent, dust drifting in the pale sunlight. But in that silence, Sam had become the unseen link between history and survival. In the weeks to come, the wall would prepare, lords would rally, and dragons would cross the sea. But it was here, in forgotten parchment and meticulous record-keeping, that the foundation for the war to come was being laid. Chapter 57, The Man Who Will Not Kneel. Bolvi Jon, Daenerys. Jon Snow arrived without banners. The camp announced itself long before he reached its center. The low thunder of wings shifting, the hiss of coals disturbed, the disciplined murmur of an army that had crossed seas and survived it. He dismounted where the ground hardened from trampled earth to deliberate order. Unsullied stood like posts driven into the world. Dothraki watched from the edges, curiosity sharpened by restraint. Dragons slept with one eye open. No one told him to kneel. No one told him not to. Jon walked forward anyway, slow enough to be read, steady enough to refuse misinterpretation. He did not look up at the dragons first. He looked at the people. That choice alone carried weight. Daenerys Targaryen waited where command naturally settled. No throne, no dais, only space arranged to face her. The light caught in her hair and fell away again. She studied him with a patience born conquest and loss. Measuring posture, breath, the silence between steps. "You come alone," she said. "I came honestly," Jon replied. "Others wait where they are useful." A faint smile touched her mouth and left. "That is not an answer most men give me. I'm not here to be most men." Tyrion Lannister stood off to the side, hands folded, eyes sharp. He said nothing. He was listening for the rhythm beneath the words. Jon stopped at a respectful distance. He did not bow, he did not stiffen, he stood like someone used to wind. "I won't kneel," Jon said plainly. Not defiant, not apologetic. "I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." The camp seemed to draw a breath. Daenerys did not bristle. She tilted her head as if testing a thought against gravity. "Many have refused me," she said. "Few survive the refusal." "I didn't come to survive a conversation," Jon answered. "I came to finish one that's already started." He knelt then, but only enough to set what he carried on the ground between them. Not tribute, evidence. Fragments first, frost-burned wood, iron warped in ways fire did not explain. A shard of pale crystal wrapped in cloth that numbed the air around it, then papers, accounts in different hands, different inks, different fears. Watch reports. Wilding testimonies, maester annotations that did not speculate, only compared. "These are not prophecies," Jon said. "They don't ask to be believed. They asked to be checked." Daenerys crouched, close enough to feel the cold from the shard. Her breath fogged. One dragon shifted, uneasy. "You come with stories," she said. "The world is full of them. So is history," Jon replied. "These stories line up." She rose and circled him slowly, the way a commander might circle a new weapon. "And you?" she asked. "Where do you fit among your papers?" Jon met her eyes. "I crossed beyond the wall under truce. I saw movement without haste. Lines that don't break, dead that don't hunger. They don't raid, they don't threaten, they wait. For what? For us to finish arguing. The words landed without force. That was what made them heavy. Daenerys stopped. You expect me to believe an enemy greater than kings waits in the snow while I decide my claim. I expect you to notice, Jon said, that I didn't ask you to give it up. A beat, then another. She turned sharper now. You gather councils. You write every lord the same letter. You speak of unity, and yet you stand here and refuse to kneel. What are you, Jon Snow? He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was without flourish. A witness. Tyrion's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. Daenerys searched Jon's face for ambition and found none she could name. You could have come as a king, she said. Men would have followed you. They already follow the truth, Jon said. That's harder to rule. She pressed, and after this war, you promise what then? Do you step aside? Do you disappear north again with your shadows and cold? If we live, Jon said, we decide then, not before. Silence stretched, the dragons stilled. Daenerys straightened, her voice, when it came, was cool and controlled. You don't want my throne. No, Jon said. That answer unsettled her more than defiance ever could. She looked at Tyrion. He gave a careful nod, not agreement, not dissent. Assessment. Daenerys returned her gaze to Jon. For the first time, something like caution edged her certainty. He does not want my throne, she thought, and the realization settled like a new weight. That makes him dangerous, not because he would take it, because he wouldn't. Chapter 58, Fire is not enough. POV. Daenerys. Fire had always answered her. From the red waste to the smoking ruins of Assapor, from the screaming towers of Meereen to the decks of ships that carried her west. Fire had been certainty. Dragons burned what defied her. Flame reduced complexity to ash. Fear bent men faster than speeches ever could. That truth had shaped her. But Westeros was different. Daenerys stood on a rise overlooking her camp as dawn bled slowly into the gray sky. The land felt older here, heavier, even the air resisted her breath, sharp and unforgiving. Her dragons sensed it. Drogon paced restlessly along the scorched earth, wings half spread, his low rumble vibrating through her bones. Rhaegal and Viserion remained closer than usual, their movements cautious, their eyes tracking the horizon rather than the camp. They did not like the cold. That unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had expected resistance, lords slow to bend, whispers of treachery, cautious allies, weighing her strength. She had not expected hesitation from the creatures who had never known fear. Dragons were fire incarnate. They did not doubt. They did not recoil. Yet here they were, uneasy. Tyrion approached quietly, careful not to startle her thoughts. He had learned that much since Meereen. She did not turn at once, but she knew he was there. They feel it, he said softly, as if speaking too loudly might provoke the world itself. The cold. They have flown through snow before, Daenerys replied. They burned Lozerine camps in winter storms. This is nothing new. Tyrion did not argue. He rarely did when she spoke like this. Instead, he gestured toward the tent where the maesters waited. Men in gray robes, chains heavy with links of many metals, faces drawn trite with the weight of what they carried. Fire has rules, Tyrion said. What they're describing does not... That was what troubled her. The proofs had come slowly, methodically, not proclamations, not prophecy. Records, drawings, accounts written in different hands, across centuries, separated by time and geography, but aligned in detail. Cold-born enemies, dead that walked without hunger or rage. Weapons that shattered against ice-white blades, fire that slowed them, but did not always stop them. Daenerys had listened in silence as the maesters spoke. She had wanted to dismiss them. She had wanted to say dragons will burn them all and be done with it. But then one maester old, nearly blind, had described a battle in the north thousands of years ago, recorded by men who did not know Valyria, did not know dragons, did not know her, and yet they described the same stillness Jon Snow had spoken of, the same patience, the same certainty, an enemy that did not conquer, an enemy that waited, that frightened her more than any army, because conquest was something she understood. Rule was something she could take. This was something else. She entered the tent at last. The maesters bowed, not deeply, not theatrically. They treated her as a sovereign, but not as a savior. That too was new. Your Grace, one began, laying out parchment carefully. We do not claim certainty, only pattern. Daenerys studied the drawings, figures of ice and shadow, diagrams of weapons marked ineffective, annotations about dragon glass, Valyrian steel, fire used in controlled bursts rather than open flame. Fireworks, she said. You all agree on that. It works, the Maester replied carefully, until it does not. These creatures adapt, they endure, they do not feel fear, they do not break. And dragons? She pressed. The silence that followed was answer enough. Afterward, she walked alone. The camp bustled with life. Unsullied drilling with perfect discipline. Dothraki riders, testing horses, unsuited to the Westerosi cold, banners snapping in the wind. It was an army meant to conquer kingdoms, and yet she saw it now as Jon Snow must have, an army that could burn cities, but not inevitability. She found Drogon at the edge of the camp, his great head lowered, nostrils flaring as frost crept along the ground. She placed a hand against his warm scales. He leaned into her touch, but his eyes never left the north. You've never been afraid, she whispered. Not of armies, not of storms, not of me. He rumbled, low and uneasy. Daenerys closed her eyes. She thought of her life, of being sold, of being hunted, of learning to command men who did not believe in her. Every victory she had won had come from refusing to bend, from insisting the world yield to her will. But Westeros would not this time. Because this enemy could not be ruled. It could not be threatened. It could not be bargained with. Fire alone would not end it. She summoned Tyrion that evening. He arrived with his usual careful neutrality, though she could see the tension beneath it. He had expected this conversation. He had feared it too. I will fight, Daenerys said without preamble. Tyrion did not smile. He did not bow. He simply waited. I will commit my armies, she continued. My dragons, my ships. Not as a gesture, as strategy. And after, he asked gently. She met his gaze unflinching. After this, we speak again. Tyrion exhaled slowly. That's wiser than many queens I've known. I am not choosing humility, she said. I am choosing survival. That night, she stood beneath the stars and watched the cold creep farther south. Somewhere beyond the horizon, an army marched that did not sing, did not boast, did not tire. For the first time since her dragons were born, Daenerys Targaryen understood something fundamental. Fire could change the world, but it could not save it alone. And when dawn came, she would ride not as a conqueror, but as a necessary ally, standing on the narrow ground between frost and flame. Chapter 59. The Gathering of the Living. POV. Multiple lords. The hall chosen for the gathering had no throne. That absence was deliberate. Winterfell's great hall had been cleared of banners, sigils, and seats of privilege. Long tables replaced the high dais. Benches were set evenly without elevation. Torches burned low, not for atmosphere, but for warmth. Even here, the cold pressed inward, persistent and unsympathetic. The realm had gathered, but it had not come to celebrate. They arrived in ones and twos, at first. Northern lords hardened by months of preparation, river lords wary, but attentive. Vale men stiff with discipline. Reach envoys masked behind courtesy. Even Dornish representatives stood quietly at the edges, eyes sharp, listening before speaking. No one announced themselves loudly. No one demanded precedence. This was not a court, it was a reckoning. Dearest Targaryen entered without proclamation. Her dragons remained outside the walls, felt more than seen. Their presence a pressure in the air, like distant thunder. She took a seat among the others, not at the there, not above equal by choice, not diminished by it. Some watched her closely, others pretended not to. No one knelt. Jon Snow stood only when all were present. He did not raise his voice, he did not posture, he simply began. We are not here to decide who rules, he said. We are here because something is coming that does not care who does. A murmur moved through the hall. Not dissent, not agreement, but recognition. This was not the first time any had heard these words. Letters had come before him, ravens heavy with identical truth. But hearing it spoken, plainly and without adornment, carried a different weight. Joe gestured, and Samwell Tarly stepped forward. Arms full of scrolls and ledgers bound in plain leather. No sigils marked them, no seals demanded belief. Sam's hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the importance of what he carried. These are not prophecies, Sam said, voice steady despite himself. They are records, watch logs, citadel fragments, accounts written by men who expected no one to read them. Masters moved forward instinctively, drawn by the promise of corroboration. Scrolls were unrolled. Diagrams exposed, descriptions repeated across centuries, cold that lingered, dead that did not rot, weapons that failed where fire and obsidian did not. A Lord of the Reach frowned. You expect us to commit armies on the word of Jan cut in gently, not unkindly. On the word of survivors, on patterns repeated long enough to become undeniable, on evidence that does not benefit any single house. He placed a final object on the table, a shard, pale, wrong. It did not melt near the torches. Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the sort that settles when certainty begins to crack. I saw them, Jon continued. Not charging, not raiding, marching, in formation. With time. A river lord swallowed. How many? Jon shook his head once. Enough that counting no longer matters. That landed harder than any number. Daenerys spoke then, not loudly, but clearly. My dragons felt it, she said. The cold. They do not fear much. They feared this. Eyes turned to her, not with devotion, not with resentment, but with recalibration. Fire had entered the equation, not as salvation, but as necessity. Jon did not yield the floor. Victory is not assured, he said. Survival is not promised. I will not tell you this war can be won. Only that it cannot be avoided. He looked at them one by one. I ask for everything, he said. Every soldier, every forge, every mine of dragon glass, every cart of grain. No house exempt, no war held in reserve. No crown was offered. No allegiance demanded. The decision, when it came, did not arrive as a shout or a cheer. It came as movement. A northern lord stood and placed his seal upon the table. Then a river lord. Then a reach envoy, jaw tight, nodding once. Even hesitation became commitment. One by one, orders were spoken quietly. Messengers dispatched immediately. Lists drawn. Supplies counted. Dragonglass shipments began their long journey north. Forges were repurposed. Ravens flew, not with politics, but with logistics. For the first time in a generation, the realm moved as one, not behind a king, not beneath a banner, but toward a war that did not care who led, only whether they stood together. Jon sat back down when it was done. He had not won them, he had warned them, and they had chosen to listen. Chapter 60, the name Ned never spoke. Povey, Jon, Ned. The room Ned chose was not the solar nor the Lord's chamber, nor any place where banners hung or titles breathed. It was a narrow study built into Winterfell's oldest stone, a place that smelled of dust, old parchment, and cold iron. The fire burned low, more habit than warmth. Outside, the castle settled into evening, boots on stone, voices fading, ravens quieting for the night. Jon stood near the door at first, as he always did in unfamiliar rooms, though this one was not unfamiliar at all. He had stood here as a boy, waiting while Ned read reports or wrote letters that never seemed to end. Back then, the room had felt enormous. Now it felt tight, as though the walls themselves were listening. Ned Stark did not ask him to sit. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Jon watched his father. No, Ned moved slowly to the table. His movements careful, deliberate. He looked older than Jon remembered, though the years had not softened him. If anything, they had sharpened the lines around his eyes, carved deeper grooves into a face that had always carried more duty than comfort. You're leaving again, Ned said at last. Yes, Jon answered simply. Before dawn. Ned nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. Silence returned, heavier this time. Jon felt it press against him, the way the cold pressed against Castle Black in the deep night, unrelenting, patient. There are things, Ned said slowly, that should have been spoken long ago. Jon did not reply. He had learned, over months at the wall and years before it, that silence could be a question if held long enough. Ned's hand tightened briefly on the edge of the table. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of command and ceremony. I am not a man given to excuses, Ned said, nor to speeches. What I am about to tell you is not justification, it is not forgiveness, it is truth. Jon felt something shift inside him, not fear, not hope, but a quiet bracing, like a man leaning into a coming wind. Ned turned to face him fully. You were never meant to be raised as you were, he said. In shadow, in uncertainty. That was my choice. Mine alone. Jon's brow furrowed slightly, though he did not interrupt. Your mother, Ned continued, and for the first time his voice wavered, just barely, was Lyanna. The name landed without thunder. Not because it lacked power, but because Jon had carried it unknowingly for his entire life. Lyanna Stark had always been a presence in Winterfell, spoken of softly, remembered fiercely, mourned without end. Jon had grown up beneath her ghost without ever realizing how close she stood. Lyanna, she died at the Tower of Joy, Ned said. In Doran. She was afraid. Not for herself. For you. Jon swallowed. His mind reached instinctively for denial but found no foothold. The pieces, too many of them, shifted, aligned, clicked into a pattern he had never dared imagine. She made me promise, Ned said, to protect you, to hide you, to let you live. Hide me from what? Jon asked quietly. Ned did not answer immediately. When he did, the words were heavy, as though he had carried them in his chest for decades. From your father. Jon felt the room tilt, just slightly. Rhaegar Targaryen, Ned said. For a heartbeat, Jon heard nothing. Not the fire, not the wind outside, not his own breath. The name carried history with it, soaked in rebellion, fire, and blood. Songs painted Rhaegar as a prince of silver and sorrow. War had named him something else entirely. My father is dead, Jon said after a moment. Yes, Ned replied. He is, but his name has never truly been buried. Jon turned away then, pacing once across the narrow room. His thoughts were sharp, cutting, refusing to settle. He thought of the wall, of the dead things marching south, of the long nights where bloodlines meant nothing at all. You knew, Jon said. It was not accusation. It was fact. I knew, Ned agreed. Master Aemon knew as well. He recognized the signs long before you ever set foot at the wall. Jon stopped slowly. He turned back. Aemon? He asked. Ned nodded. He was Rhaegar's great uncle. He chose the wall to escape crowns. When he saw you, he chose silence instead. Jon exhaled, something like understanding flickering briefly across his face. The sword, Ned said, the one he gave you, and the chest. Those were not gifts of chance. They were heritage. Left behind, hidden, waiting for a future no one dared to name. Jon closed his eyes for a moment. Dragon egg, sword, blood, any other time, any other war, any other man, this truth would have shattered the world. Instead it felt small, not insignificant, never that, but distant like a mountain glimpsed beyond a storm. When Jon opened his eyes, they were steady. I am not your son, he said slowly. Ned flinched, just slightly. You are? Jon continued in every way that matters. Whatever blood runs in my veins, you chose to raise me. You chose to bear the weight. That does not vanish, because a name changes. Ned's shoulders sagged, just a fraction. Relief did not come to him easily, but something like it passed through his expression. I did wrong by you, Ned said. I know that. You did what you believed would keep the realm from burning, Jon replied. And now the realm is freezing instead. A ghost of a smile touched Ned's lips, brief and sad. You will not claim it, Ned said. It was not a question. No, Jon said immediately. Not now, not ever, if I can help it. Ned searched his face. Even knowing what you are, Jon met his gaze without hesitation. The dead don't care who my father was. The words settled into the room, final and unyielding. There will be time, Jon continued, to argue over thrones and blood and ancient rights if we survive. Until then, I am what I have always been. A man standing between the living and what comes for them. Ned nodded once, deeply, respectfully. You've grown beyond me, he said quietly. Jon shook his head. I learned from you. They stood there for a moment longer. Two men bound by a truth that had waited decades to breathe. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the distant sound of horns being tested along the walls. Time was moving again. Jon turned toward the door. I'll return when this is done, he said. If it can be done. Ned placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, grounding, unmistakably a father's touch. Come back alive, he said. Names can wait. Jon nodded, then stepped out into the cold, carrying with him a truth that would change nothing and everything. Only after the world survived long enough to hear it. Chapter 61, The Last Watcher. Puvi, Jon. The wall did not greet Jon when he returned to it. It did not loom or judge or whisper its age into his bones. It simply stood, pale and immense, as it always had, an old truth that did not care who approached it or why. Jon found that comforting in a way he could not name. Castle Black was quieter than memory allowed. The great preparations had not yet begun in full. The realm had not yet poured itself north in iron and banners. For now, the wall belonged to its watchers again. Men moved with lowered voice, even the ravens seemed subdued. their calls sharper but fewer, as if they sensed something ending. Master Aenon was dying. Jon had known it before anyone told him. He felt it in the way the corridors narrowed as he walked, in the way his steps slowed without command. Some endings announce themselves, others simply wait until you arrive. Yatsomun's chamber was warm in a way that felt wrong for the wall. Braziers burned low, their light unsteady. Shadows clung to the stone like reluctant witnesses. The old master lay small beneath his blankets, his frame diminished almost to absence, but his face lined, blind, ancient, was alert. When Jon entered, Eamon turned his head slightly, as if sight had never been required for recognition. "You came back," Aim said. Jon sat beside the bed, without ceremony. He did not kneel. He did not speak at first. The silence between them was familiar. Earned. "I did," Jon replied. Eamon nodded faintly. "Good. Then I may finish what I never began." There was no drama in his voice, no trembling confession, just statement. A man correcting a record before it closed forever. "I am sorry," Eamon said. The words were simple. They struck harder for it. Jon exhaled slowly. "For what?" "For choosing silence when truth was heavier," Eamon said. "For believing delay was protection. For thinking time was kinder than knowledge." Jon looked at his hands. Scarred. Calloused. Hands that had held steel rope. Dying men. "You did protect me," he said quietly. Yaxamin smiled. "Barely. From crowns," he said. "Yes. From the weight of names and the hunger of men, but not from winter." He shifted slightly, pain flickering across his face like a passing cloud. Jon waited. He had learned that some truths required patience more than questions. "The sword," Aemon said at last. "The one I gave you. It is older than Valyria. Older than the Freehold's arrogance. Older than their fire and pride. It was not forged to conquer. It was forged to remember." Jox's attention sharpened. "It was wielded by the last man who wounded the Night King," Aemon continued. "Not killed him. Wounded him. That distinction matters. Steel alone could not end such a thing, but it could reach him. Mark him. Scar him in ways that time could not fully erase." Jon felt something stir, not in his blood, but deeper, like a pressure behind thought. "You said it was powerful." "It is not power," Aemon said. "Not as men understand it. The blade carries memory, intent. The echo of a will that once stood where you stand now. When you hold it, you do not borrow strength. You inherit perspective." Jon said nothing. He thought of moments in battle where the blade felt heavy with more than weight, of instincts that did not feel learned. "And the egg?" Jon asked. Rouzier Lemoine's lips pressed together, then eased. "Not unborn," he said. "Not dormant in the way men imagine. That dragon lived. Fully. It flew. It burned. It fought something older than names. When its rider fell, the magic that shattered the battlefield shattered the dragon as well. Not body, but being. Its essence was sealed. Preserved. Asleep enforced, not chosen." Jon's throat tightened. "Why an egg?" "Because that is the shape of waiting," Aemsony replied. "And because magic respects beginnings." He turned his face slightly toward Jon, blind eyes reflecting firelight. "The dragon sleeps, Jon Snow, not as a child, but as a memory of itself. It waits for a force that resonates with what it was, and what broke it." Jon thought of blood, of pain, of the cold he had seen move with purpose beyond the wall. "I never knew how to wake it," Aemon said. "There was no shame in the admission. I found the knowledge by chance, buried in a Valyrian account. No one bothered to translate, a footnote to a catastrophe. I kept it because I could not destroy it. I hid it because I could not trust the world with it." "And now?" Jon asked. "Now the world has come anyway," Aemon said. His breath was shallow now, measured. "Take the egg from the chest. Do not leave it behind. Keep it close when steel meets winter. If it wakes, it will not be because you commanded it, but because something recognized you." Jon swallowed. "Why me?" Aemon's smile returned, faint but certain. "Because you do not seek to be more than you are, and because the blade remembers you as someone who listened." Silence settled again. Not heavy. Complete. "I wanted to give you time," Aenyen said softly. "Time to choose your life before others chose it for you. I see now time was the one thing winter would never grant." Jon stood slowly. He placed his hand over Aemon's thin, warm, still alive. You gave me what you could, he said, and more than most. The Yavim's fingers tightened once, just once. I protected you from crowns, he whispered. I could not protect the world from winter. His breath left him after that. No struggle, no final gasp, just absence, like a candle deciding it had burned long enough. Jon remained where he was long after the body cooled. That night, the bells did not ring. The wall did not mark the passing of one more old man, but Jon did. And when he left the chamber, the chest was lighter in his arms, its contents no longer hidden, no longer waiting alone. Chapter 62, Fire and Farewell. POV, Jon, Daenerys. Purpose, end of an age. The fire was built at dawn, when the wall still held the night in its stones. It stood apart from the usual yards. No training ground, no execution square. Raised instead on a narrow stretch where the ice gave way to rock, the brothers of the Night's Watch formed a rough half-circle, black cloaks unmoving in the still air. Wildlings stood beyond them, not segregated, not announced, simply present. Maesters from the Citadel watched quietly, hands folded, eyes lowered. No one spoke above a whisper. The wall did not demand silence. It imposed it. Jon stood nearest the pyre. The body was small beneath the cloth, lighter than Jon remembered Maester Aemon ever being in life. The old man had seemed eternal once, frail, blind, bent, yet immovable as a cornerstone. Now he was only what remained, wrapped in black and white, the colors of a life spent refusing crowns and enduring winters. Jon had expected grief to strike like a blow. Instead, it settled like frost, thin, persistent, unavoidable. Daenerys arrived without announcement. There were murmurs at first, soft, uncertain. But no challenge followed. She wore no crown, no silks, no dragon brooch to declare herself more than she was. Her cloak was plain, clasped simply at the throat. When she took her place beside Jon, she did not look at the pyre immediately. She looked at the wall. So this is where he chose to live, she said quietly. Jon nodded, where he chose not to rule. That earned a small, sad breath of a laugh from her. He was the only one of us who never wanted anything. The brothers shifted. A horn sounded once, not a call to arms, but tradition. A signal that words were finished, and duty remained. Jon stepped forward. He had prepared nothing. Aemon would have disliked speeches. He had always believed that the wall remembered better than men did. We commit Maester Aemon to the fire, Jon said, voice steady, carrying without effort. He served the Watch, he served the realm, he served without asking to be known. No titles followed, no lineage spoken. Jon felt Daenerys stiffen slightly at that, then relax, understanding the choice. A torch was passed. Jon hesitated only a heartbeat before touching flame to kindling. The fire caught slowly, reluctantly, as if even it needed to be convinced. Smoke curled upward, thin and pale, drawn north by the wall's breath. When the flames finally took, they did not roar, they whispered. Daenerys watched closely then. She had burned many dead Khalasar warriors, fallen unsullied, even enemies, but this was different. There was no conquest in it. No assertion, only release. He never asked me to claim him, she said softly. Not once, even when he knew who I was. Jon kept his eyes on the fire. He believed names were heavier than chains. Yes, she said, and he carried neither. The wildlings murmured a low sound, not a prayer, not a chant, but recognition. Among them, elders bowed their heads. Yamin had never spoken to them directly, never crossed the wall to parley. Yet his decisions had shaped the space that allowed this gathering to exist at all. Mercy, delayed but real, had been his final argument to history. As the fire burned down, the wall seemed to loom closer. Its face caught the glow, throwing long shadows that made the ice look lined, ancient, almost weary. Jon felt it then, the absence. Not just of a man, but of a memory that had anchored the Watch to something older than oaths. Aemon had remembered when others forgot. He had held the past gently, not to rule the present, but to warn it. Now that burden shifted. Daenerys turned to Jon. You carry what he left behind. Jon didn't deny it. I carry what he couldn't finish. She studied him. Really studied him. Not as a claimant, not as a rival, but as something more dangerous and rare, a man shaped by refusal. Blood binds, she said, echoing words he had spoken earlier. But duty defines. Jon met her gaze. He taught me that without ever saying it. The fire collapsed inward, embers settling. Ash lifted and scattered against the wall, disappearing into white. There would be no grave. The Watch did not bury its memory in the ground. It sent it into the cold and trusted it to endure. When it was done, no one moved for a long moment. Then the horn sounded again, once more, low and final. The night's watch turned back to its posts. The wildlings dispersed quietly. The masters exchanged brief looks and departed, already aware that something irreplaceable had been lost. Daenerys remained until the last ember dimmed. "So few of us left," she said at last, "and the one who wanted least, gone." Jon looked north beyond the wall where winter waited with patience, older than any crown. "He expected nothing," Jon said. "That's why he mattered." They stood together in silence, the wall towering above them. Older now, not weaker, but changed. The watch had lost its memory keeper, and the world had lost a man who believed that the future should be chosen, not inherited. Chapter 63, The Living Assemble. The morning air at Castle Black was thick with the metallic scent of steel and the acrid smoke of burning torches. From the distant hills and winding roads, banners began to appear, black, gray, and the scattered colors of houses from the north, the Vale, the Riverlands, and the remnants of the Reach. Observers from Dorne, cloaked and silent, took up positions on the outer ridges, their eyes scanning the encampments. And above them all, Daenerys' dragons moved with restless patience, wings casting long shadows over the frozen courtyard, a quiet reminder that even fire might be fragile against the coming frost. No trumpets heralded their arrival. No feasts marked their gathering. The army of the living did not celebrate. There was no pomp here, only the slow, deliberate assembling of forces, each soldier aware that the march to this place had already cost lives in small skirmishes, in scouting errors, and in the months spent watching the wall's northern horizon. Jon observed from the parapets, the wind biting through his furs as he catalogued the troops, their numbers, and their readiness. His eyes lingered on every formation, every wagon, every cart loaded with supplies. Yet the calculations in his mind always returned to the same grim conclusion. There might not be enough. The first to arrive were the Northmen, bearing their spears, their shields, and the stoic endurance of winters uncounted. Robb Stark rode among them, older now than when he had led men into the south, his face etched with the awareness that no loyalty, no oath, could entirely protect them from what awaited. Behind the northern lines came contingents from the Vale, disciplined and armored, their knights mounted on horses bred for speed and resilience. They moved with purpose. Yet even their precise formations could not conceal the undercurrent of fear. They, too, had heard whispers of what waited beyond the wall. Ravens moved constantly overhead, carrying messages between command tents, each one a fragment of coordination, each one a record that some of the living still survived to make sense of the reports that Jon had begun sending north months ago. From the Riverlands came lords with small banners, wary of standing too close to the north, yet aware that neutrality would be a death sentence. Their troops were fewer, but their presence added weight to the alliance, a reminder that this was not only a northern problem, but a realm-wide one. Remnants of the Reach followed, bruised, disciplined, and cautious, each rider understanding that glory here was meaningless if the dead could not be stopped. Even the observers from Dorne maintained distance, noting quietly the coordination of siege engineers, the placement of wagons stacked with dragonglass, and the careful storage of alchemical oils meant for defensive fire. These were the preparations of people who understood the stakes. The enemy they faced did not bend, did not negotiate, and did not tire. They only waited, patient, inexorable. Daenerys' forces arrived last, with disciplined precision. Her armies, accustomed to conquest and speed, adjusted to the northern cold with visible effort. The dragons moved through the sky with measured beats of their wings, testing currents and air temperatures, casting shadows over men and animals alike. Their roars echoed over the camp, not in triumph, but as a warning, a reminder that fire alone could not save them. Tyrion walked beside her, cataloging the available forces and tallying what they had, versus what Jon claimed would come. His face, usually animated with schemes and sarcasm, was sober, and he whispered only to those close. "This is not a victory yet. We are alive only because we have chosen to be, not because fate has smiled." Jon moved among the camp silently, acknowledging lords and captains with a nod, not a word. He inspected the wagons containing dragonglass, confirming the counts himself. He walked along lines of soldiers carrying Valyrian steel blades, touching each one lightly, a ritual of silent inspection. Alchemical oils were stacked in barrels, ready for use in traps, in fire lines, in whatever desperate stratagems they could deploy. Every item, every weapon, every measure of preparation was catalogued in his mind. This was not theater. This was the calculus of survival. Small fires dotted the encampment, tending both men and horses alike. Some of the lords attempted to meet in hushed councils, quietly coordinating patrols and perimeter defenses, yet their discussions never strayed from the gravity of the task. No jest, no boast, no bravado. Each lord knew the numbers were unknowable, each soldier aware that this war could take them all without mercy. Even Daenerys, standing among her generals, did not demand admiration or fealty. She observed the forces, assessed their coordination, and measured the subtle indications of morale and readiness. From the far side of the courtyard, Jon watched as Sam moved among the maesters and scribes, distributing copies of reports, cross-referencing ancient records with the first-hand accounts brought from beyond the wall. The Citadel's confirmations lent weight to the warnings Jon had delivered months ago, and even the skeptical lords could no longer deny the reality of what they faced. Numbers, names, and proofs lined the tables, frost-bitten patrols, fragments of weapons shattered by cold that should not have held, testimonies of wildlings who had seen armies that did not sleep, armies that did not tire, and did not speak. He let the silent testimony of preparation speak for him. He allowed the lords to see the full scope, to understand that the enemy would not yield and that every soldier, every piece of dragonglass, every ounce of fire and steel mattered. He walked slowly along the lines of troops, noting both the fear in their eyes and the resolve in their stance. The presence of dragons above reminded all assembled that even fire had its limits. The dead would not flinch, would not retreat, and would not beg for mercy. As night fell, the camp glimmered with torchlight, the shadows of tents stretching long over the frozen ground. Horses snorted steam into the air, and men huddled closer to the fires, sharpening blades and recounting orders quietly. The weight of silence pressed down upon all present. Victory was not yet possible. The living had assembled. Yes, but assembly alone could not guarantee survival. Every lord, every commander, every soldier present understood that this was merely the prelude, the real reckoning. The encounter with what they could not yet name, what they could not yet quantify, was still to come. Jon remained atop the parapets, eyes tracing the northern horizon. The wall had been a warning. Castle Black was a stage. The living had gathered, the weapons were laid, and the alliances held, fragile though they might be. But Jon's mind returned constantly to what lay beyond, to the slow, inevitable movement of death across the lands, and to the knowledge that when the armies clashed, it would not be for honor, nor for crown, but for the sheer survival of those who still breathed. No cheering rose from the camp. No song heralded the assembling of the living, only the steady rhythm of preparation, the quiet adjustment of weapons, and the sober knowledge that even the might of dragons, the discipline of men, and the edge of steel might not be enough to halt the coming tide. And in that quiet, Jon understood the truth that had guided every step for months. Survival depended not on hope alone, but on readiness, unity, and the willingness to confront a darkness that would not bend for any man. The living had assembled, and for the first time in months, they were not scattered, not divided, not waiting. They were here, ready, but not unafraid, and the cost of what was to come weighed heavier than any banner, any title, or any crown. Chapter 64, What Cannot Be Counted. The scouts returned with faces pale as snow, boots crusted with frost, and hands trembling from the cold and from what they had seen. Each brought reports meant to quantify, to give numbers and positions, yet every attempt at counting collapsed under the weight of the truth. The dead moved in ways that no map, no list, no tally could ever capture. They were more than an army. They were inevitability given form, a tide that flowed beyond comprehension, beyond hope, beyond the logic of living men. Jon received them silently, listening as each scout tried to articulate what had been seen beyond the wall. One spoke of hills crawling with figures, yet when pressed, he could not give even 1/100th of the count. Another spoke of shadows moving with perfect precision, stepping across frozen rivers without sound, as if the land itself had grown obedient to them. A third had watched a valley, and when asked how many dead had passed, he could only shrug. They were more than the valley could hold. Each story ended the same way. Numbers failed, and silence swallowed understanding. Jon felt the weight of every missing figure, every unattainable count. Maps became meaningless when the enemy ignored geography. He traced lines on parchments with shaking fingers, noting retreat paths, choke points, and defensive positions. Yet he knew no numbers would ever suffice. The Night King did not attack like a man or a lord. He did not batter walls or march banners across roads. He moved like time itself, patient and deliberate, waiting for errors to multiply, waiting for the living to fracture from exhaustion and fear. Reports from the wildlings confirmed the scouts' tales. Villages abandoned, fires left cold but unextinguished, livestock gone or scattered, and bodies left intact, untouched, yet organized. Every account, coming from independent sources, reinforced the same terrifying logic. The enemy did not need to win quickly. They needed only to persist. Even the fiercest defenders, even the sharpest swords, even the dragon's fire. None of it could stop an army that did not feel urgency, that did not tire, that did not bleed in ways the living could comprehend. Jon gathered his officers in the cold tent, frost edging the fabric, the wind carrying whispers of the wall's heights beyond. He did not shout, nor did he try to inspire. Inspiration would not save them. Instead, he spoke with calm precision, issuing instructions meant to preserve what could be preserved. Lines of retreat were drawn, not as defeat, but as survival measures. Defensive positions were reinforced, not as confidence, but as contingency. Evacuations of civilians were organized quietly, almost invisibly, because every delay could be fatal. Every person mattered, and yet the weight of impossibility hung over all. "Count what you can," Jon said softly, "and then forget it. Focus on what you can change. Paths, walls, fire, steel. Every piece matters, but the enemy is more than what can be counted. We prepare not because we know the outcome, but because we must." Even the dragons were tested. Jon watched them circle, wings beating in icy gusts, flames sputtering against the cold that resisted them. They roared, not in triumph, but as warnings, as confirmations of danger. Jon understood their unease. It mirrored his own. Fire alone could not solve what could not be quantified. At night, as he stood on the wall, eyes tracing the dark horizon, Jon felt the full weight of the impossibility. The Night King was patient. The living were finite. Every choice now was measured against the reality that what approached could not be summed, could not be predicted, could not be defeated by mere numbers. The battle, Jon realized, was already a test of endurance, intelligence, and unity. The army of the dead would not make mistakes. The living had to, somehow, avoid them. And so, Jon prepared. Every formation, every evacuation, every tactical line was drawn with meticulous care. Yet with the grim knowledge that success could not be guaranteed, confidence was irrelevant. Only readiness mattered. The Night King was not attacking castles. Not yet. He was waiting for exhaustion, for fractures, for the moment when the living would stumble. Jon breathed, letting the cold pierce his lungs, letting the weight settle in his chest. This was not hope. This was responsibility. The living could be counted, the dead could not. And in that knowledge lay both fear and the clarity of action. Chapter 65, First Contact. The morning air was sharp with frost, biting through cloaks and armor alike. The front lines were silent at first, not with peace, but with the weight of anticipation. Smoke from torches and fire wagons coiled against the gray sky, carrying a smell of ash and iron. The living stood tensely, ranks lined and ready, every eye flicking to the horizon where the dead had begun their slow, methodical march. The first clash was neither sudden nor chaotic. It was deliberate, a meeting of two inevitabilities. The dead advanced with uncanny patience, neither rushing nor staggering, their silent discipline a mirror of some cold intelligence that no living man could comprehend. The living struck first, arrows launched, fire wagons rolled forward, and men cried out in the clash of steel. Valyrian blades cut, dragon glass pierced, but each success was fleeting. Every dead figure that fell seemed to vanish into the storm of bodies behind it, as though replaced by another unchanged, unfeeling, untiring. Commanders shouted orders. Jon, from a vantage point, observed the battle unfold like a study of waves against cliffs. Fire slowed the dead, but it did not stop them. Dragons roared, wings beating wind into the ranks, flames flickering against the cold that resisted even their heat. The dragon that had survived from Daenerys' force unleashed torrents of fire, and yet, for every dead incinerated, two more pressed forward. The army adapted, shifting silently, finding gaps in formations, exploiting errors with a patience the living could not match. Losses mounted quickly. Named commanders, those who had led with courage and skill in previous battles, fell first. One by one, Units that had trained for months, that had learned the intricacies of defending against the dead, vanished. Some were swallowed entirely by the horde, others scattered, retreating in disarray. The front lines became fragmented, lines bending and breaking under the pressure of an enemy that did not tire, did not flinch, did not despair. Yet victory, in the narrowest sense, was claimed. The living had not been annihilated. They had withdrawn intact, preserving the remnants of the army for the battles to come. There were no celebrations. The retreat was careful, tactical, but the silence among the ranks spoke louder than any cheer could. Men and women trudged back to defensible positions, dragging the injured, counting the dead, hearts heavy with the knowledge that the cost of survival had been far greater than expected. Morale fractured quietly, whispers of fear, unspoken questions of leadership, and the creeping dread of inevitability flowed through the camps. The soldiers did not question Jon or Daenerys directly. Their faith in their leaders was unquestioned, but the glances exchanged, the pauses in speech, the tight grips on swords and daggers, they revealed a truth no council could fully mask. The living had survived. But at what cost? The Night King's army had shown its patience, its adaptability, its cruelty. The living could not count on simple tactics or overwhelming force to secure future battles. Reports trickled back slowly to Castle Black and the temporary command posts. Every fallen unit, every vanished commander, every dragon-struck position was documented. Even those who had escaped with minimal injuries carried in their minds the image of the dead pressing forward, advancing not with hunger, but with purpose, as though the cold itself had taken shape and marched. Jon convened a quiet council that night. There were no celebrations, no rhetoric, only the sobering facts. The dead adapted. Fire alone would not suffice, and numbers of the enemy were impossible to calculate. Every man, every resource, every weapon available had been tested. Every weakness of the living had been exposed. Jon spoke plainly, without flourish. We have seen them. We have faced them. We have survived. Not because we were stronger, but because we endured, and endurance alone will not win the next day. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The commanders, lords, and knights listened, each understanding their roles would not be simple. The battle had been a lesson in cost, in the limitations of bravery, and in the necessity of cunning over recklessness. As the night fell, fires burning low, Jon walked among the troops, faces haggard, bodies aching, eyes haunted. Yet there was a spark of understanding. They had touched the dead and survived. They knew what lay ahead. The Night King had shown them patience. The living had glimpsed fragility. In that quiet, under the shadow of what had come, Jon realized the truth of war against the dead. This was not merely a fight of swords or dragons. It was a war against inevitability itself, and the living had only just begun to understand the cost. Chapter 16:6 Fire Meets Ice. The horizon was a blurred canvas of gray and white, the sun a weak smear behind clouds heavy with snow and ash. Daenerys stood tall atop Drogon's broad back, the leather reins cutting into her palms as the wind tore at her cloak. Below, the armies of the living waited, shivering in layered furs and steel. A fragile line of hope stretched against the silent advance of the dead. The first breath of winter came not as a chill, but as an intrusion, as if the air itself had learned cruelty. The dragons shifted beneath her, wings flexing nervously against the icy gusts. Drogon roared, and the fire that erupted from his maw licked the white wind, hissing in defiance. The other dragons followed suit, flaring flames that turned the snow around their feet to steam. Daenerys' heart quickened. The sight of dragons in battle had always stirred awe in friend and foe alike. But this winter was not like any she had known. Here even fire felt powerless, a temporary reprieve against something that did not move in haste. From the frozen horizon, the first wave of the dead emerged. They did not rush, they did not stagger, they moved as if the cold itself had given them patience, precision, and purpose. Daenerys' stomach twisted with recognition. This was not chaos. This was inevitability, and she had never before seen anything so singular in its focus. She barked orders at her dragons, pushing them forward in synchronized arcs of flame, but the fire did not scatter the enemy. The dead collapsed under the heat, only to rise moments later, their stillness a deception, their persistence eternal. Her gaze fell on one of the dragons, the smallest of the three, whose wings struggled against the icy currents. A spear of unnatural ice, propelled by the very storm, pierced one wing. The dragon shrieked, a sound that pierced the heart of every living soldier watching. Daenerys leaned forward, urging the beast to safety, fire sputtering weakly as the cold assaulted it from every angle. Panic surged through her chest. Dragons were not supposed to falter. They were meant to dominate, to burn, to annihilate. And yet here in this frozen battlefield, even their might was a fragile veneer. Below, the soldiers of the living pressed forward with tentative courage. Steel met steel, the clash echoing across the valley, but each encounter seemed a rehearsal rather than a victory. The cold made arrows brittle, swords heavy, and shields icy to the touch. Every strike, every clash required not only strength, but careful calculation. Daenerys realized with a sinking certainty that the living were no longer fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival. The other dragons surged, flames cutting through the blizzard, but the wind bent fire into mist. Snowflakes hissed as they touched heated scales, turning the battle into a chaotic mix of steam, frost, and flame. The largest dragon, Drogon, attempted a dive, aiming to scatter a formation of the dead, but the ice storm twisted unpredictably, striking at his wings and forcing him to pull back. Daenerys felt the reins vibrate, the strength beneath her faltering under the weight of winter itself. Even the fire that had defined her power for years seemed diluted, fighting against the very elements. One of the dragons, wounded seriously in a wing, collapsed briefly to the snow. Its roar carried fear, confusion, and pain, and Daenerys' own heart thudded painfully in her chest. She saw for the first time that her dragons were not invincible. They were powerful. Yes, but the dead did not bow to power. Fire alone could not save anyone. Fear, unbidden, slid into her mind, a sensation she had known only fleetingly in distant cities, but never so sharply in a battle where stakes dwarfed ambition. She tried to gather herself to summon the courage that had carried her through deserts, across seas, and over city walls. Yet, with each step, the landscape reminded her of the limits of her dominion. Dragons could soar, could breathe fire, could incinerate armies, and yet here they could not alter inevitability. Every dead figure that rose from a blackened flame reminded her that victory was not yet achievable. This was not a battle won by might alone. It was a test of strategy, endurance, and patience. Her eyes swept over the battlefield again, noting each faltering dragon, each hesitant soldier, each cold-breathed snow plume that marked the dead's movement. They did not rush, they did not tire. They waited, and in that patience they held the advantage. Daenerys felt her chest tighten. Her dragons were magnificent, terrifying, awe-inspiring, but they were not the solution. Fire could delay, could punish, could inspire hope, but it could not end the inevitability before her. Below, she saw soldiers falter, shields crack, and units vanish. The cold gnawed at them, not just flesh, but spirit. She realized that her role was no longer that of a conqueror. She was a guardian, a participant in a war whose scale surpassed any throne she had ever sought. Her dragons were not rulers. They were instruments, fragile and mighty, but limited. Even now, she knew one dragon would not survive unscathed if the storm pressed further, and another bore injuries she could not yet gauge. Only Drogon remained fully intact, yet even he strained under the assault of ice and wind. The wind whipped snow into faces and cloaks, and Daenerys gritted her teeth against the cold. Fear sharpened her mind. Strategy had to replace pride. Caution had to temper aggression. She could no longer think in terms of domination, of conquest, of legacy. She had to think in terms of survival, coordination, and endurance. Dragons were power, but not a solution. Fire was not enough. Strength was insufficient, and the dead, patient, and deliberate would not be deceived by spectacle. She leaned close to Drogon's neck, feeling the beat of powerful wings and the warmth beneath her hands. "We cannot win this alone," she whispered, voice nearly lost in the roar of wind and the hiss of fire. The dragon shifted, sensing the truth in her words. Its eyes reflected not only fear but understanding, a mirrored acknowledgement that what lay ahead required more than flame and claw. They were alive. That was all they could claim. And as long as they survived, hope survived. Daenerys allowed herself one moment to survey the battlefield. Seeing her dragons falter, her soldiers strain, the dead advance with inexorable calm, she understood the first truth of this winter. Power alone would not save the living. Fire was not enough. Strategy, unity, and sacrifice would be required beyond anything she had known. She felt the weight of command more keenly than ever. And with that knowledge, she tightened her grip, urging her dragons onward, not toward victory, but toward survival. The cold pierced deeper than any enemy, yet her resolve burned brighter. Fire was not enough. But it was still a weapon, and she would wield it with clarity, courage, and a newfound respect for the limits of strength. Chapter 16 and 7, The Breaking Line. The horizon was a muted gray, a seamless canvas of snow and ash that made all distinctions blur. Jon walked the frozen line, pausing only to steady himself against the wind that cut deeper than any blade. Weeks of combat had stripped the living of color, hope, and certainty. Soldiers moved like shadows, their armor dulled by frost, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Every step forward was measured not in gain but in survival. The wall, distant and unseeing, was no longer a symbol of protection. It was a memory, a promise of safety. Jon could not yet fulfill. Beyond it, the dead advanced with relentless patience, each wave more disciplined than the last. They did not charge. They did not panic. They moved as inevitability incarnate, their calm calculated, their pace deliberate. Jon's hands shook slightly as he gripped the ancient sword, the one Maester Aemon had entrusted to him. The steel was heavy with history, etched with a power he could not yet comprehend. But today, it felt inert. The memories it carried seemed muffled, distant. He had swung it against the dead, tested its edge, and felt only cold resistance. The sword had once wounded the Night King, or so the text claimed, but in his hands it was still. There was no whisper of guidance, no surge of remembered strategy. He knelt on the snow, letting it seep through his gloves, letting it remind him that even ice could not be fought away by will alone. His breath formed thin clouds, visible only to himself, while around him the dead maintained their order. Fires, carefully tended, burned in pits across the battlefield. But the heat was a mere suggestion against the vastness of winter and death. The dragon egg tucked against his chest in a specially insulated pack pulsed faintly with cold, but it gave no sign of life. Jon had imagined this moment countless times, the egg awakening, the dragon's roar cutting through the silence, a new weapon against the endless night. Yet now, faced with reality, the egg lay dormant, its secrets locked away, as surely as the ice that blanketed the world. He wondered, bitterly, if even destiny could be delayed. The armies of the living were fraying at the edges. Northern levies moved sluggishly, their lines broken by frostbite and fatigue. The Vale's knights clung to their horses with rigid discipline, but their banners hung limp in the wind. Soldiers from the Riverlands muttered, half in terror, half in frustration, while remnants of the Reach and Dorne shuffled forward like reluctant ghosts. Even Daenerys' dragons had been forced to retreat after the first day, one injured and limping, the other extinguished entirely in fire and ice. Only Drogon remained, majestic but stretched to his limits, and Jon could see the strain in every beat of his wings. He had tried every tactic he knew, he had listened to his counselors, the maesters, and even the whispers of the wildlings. Every plan had met the same outcome, stalemate. Every attempt to break the line of the dead had cost lives without turning the tide. Yet the dead did not hurry, they did not stumble, they did not show mercy or impatience. They simply were, and that existence was enough to crush hope. Jane's eyes swept the battlefield, searching for any sign of advantage, any flaw in the endless white tide. Soldiers carried wounded comrades on their backs, dragging them through snow that had frozen over weeks of blood and ice. Corpses, once human, littered the frozen ground, uncountable and unyielding. Each body was a lesson in futility. They rose again, or if they did not, their absence did not alter the advance. He felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a physical force. Every order mattered, every hesitation deadly, and yet he doubted himself. Not his courage, he had never questioned that, but his decisions, his strategies, his very understanding of the war they were waging. The ancient sword did not guide him. The egg did not awaken. All the gifts Aemon had trusted him with, all the relics of an older world felt inert in the hands of a living man facing an army without end. Jon's mind wandered briefly to his family, to Winterfell, and to the faces of those he loved. Robb, steadfast and determined, was coordinating defenses, but even he could not mask the exhaustion in his movements. Aerys and Sansa were far to the south, preparing for contingencies he could not yet see. Even Daenerys, fierce and resolute, had begun to temper her fire with caution. They were alive, but not winning. And he, as much as any, carried the burden of knowing that leadership did not equate to control. The cold gnawed at him, but worse was the weight of inevitability. The dead did not tire. They did not falter. They did not fear. They moved forward in perfect patience, understanding that the living were the flawed creatures, bound by heat, hunger, and emotion. Jon felt each hour of command stretch endlessly, every decision grinding against the impossible calculus of survival. Victory was not merely uncertain. It felt unreachable. He clenched the sword tighter, letting the cold seep into his bones as a reminder of his mortality. If this were the end, he would face it with the same resolve he had always carried. The egg at his chest seemed to sense his despair, pulsing faintly as if acknowledging his will, but still unbroken. The army around him shuffled forward, soldiers murmuring prayers or curses in equal measure, eyes wide with exhaustion and awe. Jon allowed himself a moment to imagine the dead as anything else, wind, snow, shadow. But even in his mind, their inevitability persisted. This was not merely a battle, it was a trial of endurance, of spirit, of the limits of what it meant to be human. He could not command fire to burn forever, nor hope to wield steel against inevitability itself. He could only watch, measure, and prepare. The realization settled in, heavy and undeniable. The sword was history, the egg was potential, and he was human. The line would break, the living would falter, and winter would continue its march, whether he acted or not. Jon rose slowly, shoulders aching, eyes locked on the advancing dead. He would fight, he would lead, he would endure. But for the first time, he understood the absolute scale of the threat, the price of every step forward, and the limits of everything he had ever known. The sword in his hand, the egg against his chest, the soldiers around him, they were all part of a fragile hope. One day, he knew, they might matter. But today, the line was breaking, and the living were only barely holding. He looked to the sky, where the remaining dragons circled, wings cutting against the blizzard, fires sputtering but unbowed. Fire was not enough. Ice would not relent, and Jon Snow, for the first time in his life, felt what it truly meant to be small against a world determined to end. Yet even in this lowest hour, he did not kneel. He did not despair fully. He gripped the sword again, felt the pulse of the egg, and braced himself for whatever winter would throw next. The line was breaking, the dead were patient, the living were desperate. And Jon Snow, battered, bleeding, and uncertain, was the only man standing between inevitability and what little hope remained. Chapter 68, The Night King, advances. The wind carried a biting chill, sharper than any winter storm Jon had endured. It seemed to press against armor, cloak, and skin alike, demanding submission. The battlefield, already a frozen expanse of snow and mud, seemed to shrink under the Night King's approach, as if the world itself recognized the presence of something ancient and unrelenting. Soldiers, once moving with purpose, paused mid-step, their breaths ragged puffs of mist that disappeared instantly into the emptiness. The first sign was subtle, a wave of cold so absolute it seemed unnatural, even beyond the winter they had all grown accustomed to. The fires at the front line flickered and waned. Torches guttered. Wagons of pitch and oil struggled to stay alight, the flames choking in the invisible pressure of ice that accompanied him. Dragons above beat their wings against the storm, but even Drogon's fire sputtered. A brief flare swallowed by the oppressive cold. The dead marched forward, not rushing, not staggering, not faltering, only moving with perfect, terrifying coordination. Jon stood on the ridge, the sword in his hand, heavy with both history and the weight of uncertainty. His gaze stretched across the frozen expanse, sweeping over the lines of the living, men and women who had stood bravely for weeks, now faltered. Knights from the Vale gripped their lances as their horses shivered, unwilling to charge through the thick frost that seemed to emanate from the Night King himself. Soldiers from the north dug heels into the snow, trying to hold ground, but the ice beneath their boots made every step uncertain. The Riverland's levies murmured prayers they no longer believed, while Dorne's soldiers cursed in languages even Jon did not recognize, and then he appeared, the Night King. Not through scouts' warnings, not in fragments glimpsed between trees, but fully, standing atop a rise where the snow seemed unnaturally flattened beneath his feet. His presence was precise, deliberate, a dark symmetry against the pale world. No banners marked him, no war horns heralded him. He needed none. Even the air seemed to acknowledge him, vibrating with the silent hum of inevitable doom. Magic radiated outward, subtle at first, a distortion in the air that warped light and sound. Zhuang, sensing the shift, let out a frustrated roar, wings beating furiously. But his fire, so often a harbinger of hope, was muted, struggling against the invisible weight, pressing down from the Night King. Other fire wagons ignited, but the flames sputtered and dimmed as if smothered by an unseen hand. Alchemical oils failed to explode with their usual brilliance. Valyrian steel touched the undead, only to meet unyielding resistance. Even the weapons that had harmed lesser dead seemed suddenly less potent, slowed by the deliberate magic that flowed from him like a cold river. Ja's voice carried across the ridge, cracking against the wind. "Hold formation! Do not let them break us!" But the words felt small, almost absurd. The living tried, as they always tried, to follow orders to maintain structure, yet coordination was slipping. Microsecond by microsecond, units broke, unable to hold against the advancing tide. Retreat lines became clogged with panicked soldiers. Cavalry skidded in the frost, breaking ranks. Foot soldiers stumbled over their comrades, their shouts drowned in the wind and snow. He signaled the fallback. "Pull back to secondary positions. Keep the wounded moving." The men around him obeyed, but too slowly. Already the first wave of the dead had closed in on the outermost lines. Shapes that had once seemed human now moved with an eerie precision, cutting across the snow in patterns that no living mind could anticipate. They did not scream, they did not roar, they did not hesitate. They simply were, and in their being, the living felt the full weight of their mortality. Jon's eyes flicked to Drogon again. The dragon beat his wings fiercely, smoke trailing in ragged bursts, but even his efforts did little to turn the tide. Ice seemed to gather on his scales mid-flight, and his fire, usually a brilliant orange against white, burned pale and weak. Behind Jon, the armies tried to regroup, but the panic had already seeded. Horses reared, soldiers slipped, and in the chaos, more than a dozen fell, either trapped under fallen comrades or caught by the advancing dead. From the edge of his vision, Jon saw the Night King raise his arms, slow and deliberate. The wind changed, twisting unnaturally around him. A subtle pulse of energy rippled through the battlefield, one that suppressed flames, dulled steel, and made the soldiers' hearts pound in irrational fear. It was not an immediate attack. There were no arrows, no lightning, but the effect was undeniable. The living faltered, unsure whether to advance or retreat, and in that hesitation, lives were lost. Jon felt his gut tighten. He understood now, in the stark clarity of survival, that this was unlike any enemy he had faced. No strategy, no formation, no alliance, no armor would be enough if the Night King moved. The dead did not merely respond to attacks. They anticipated, adapted, and corrected. Every fallen soldier seemed to vanish, only to reinforce the endless tide. Every fire erected to halt them flickered weakly and died. Every weapon swung met nothing but resistance, as though the ice itself had hardened into a wall between life and death. The first casualties were personal and immediate. Commanders he had relied upon for weeks, men he knew by face, by voice, by courage, fell, not spectacularly, not in heroic charge, but swept away as easily as leaves before a storm. Jon could see the panic ripple through the ranks, soldiers crying out, weapons clanging against the air, but never finding flesh. Retreat lines jammed, communication broke down. A snow-covered hill that had been a defensible ridge became a trap, a bottleneck that the dead exploited without haste, without error. Jon made the decision that would cost many lives, but might save the rest. Full fallback, to secondary positions. Protect the wounded. His shout carried through the wind, hoarse and desperate. Men and women obeyed, but the pullback was chaotic. Soldiers slipped, fell into snowdrifts, and were picked off by the coordinated undead advance. The dead did not need to chase, simply standing in the right places, advancing with patience, allowed them to claim life after life. Jon's heart pounded. He gripped the sword tighter. It had felt empty in recent weeks, weighed down by history that no longer seemed relevant. The egg packed against his back pulsed faintly, but still remained inert. He felt a cold shiver. Not from the wind, not from exhaustion, but from the certainty of being outmatched. Every instinct, Every memory of leadership, every strategy he had rehearsed for months seemed insufficient against the patient inevitability before him. Through the chaos, Jon's mind worked frantically. He could see patterns in the dead's movement, subtle shifts in their formation, but the scale was staggering. No calculation, no estimation could fully account for the numbers arrayed against him. Retreat lines had become crowded corridors of survival, fires were suppressed, and the once disciplined forces of the living were fractured, exhausted, human. And yet, even in the face of despair, Jon acted. Orders were shouted again, lines reformed as best as possible, wounded moved with help, and archers fired in concentrated volleys. The dead adapted instantly, but the act of resistance, small though it was, gave some measure of breathing space to the living. Chaos reigned, but within it, the will to survive persisted, fragile as it might be. The Night King advanced at his own pace, cold, deliberate, unhurried, yet every second of his movement rippled across the battlefield like the inevitable pull of a tide. Fire sputtered and froze, steel dulled and cracked, and soldiers fell, but he did not hurry. There was no frenzy, no excitement, only the certainty that time was on his side. Jon looked over the broken ranks, over the faltering lines of knights, soldiers, and dragons, and understood fully for the first time the scale of the war ahead. This was not merely a fight for land, or crown, or survival in the moment. It was a battle for existence itself. Every decision, every movement, every second mattered. But the enemy did not count seconds. It counted lives. The living could no longer measure the dead, could not anticipate them, could not truly challenge them. The Night King's advance was patient, inevitable, complete, and in that moment, Jon realized that no matter the courage, no matter the strategy, no matter the fire or steel or Valyrian magic they brought, the living were barely keeping pace with an enemy that had all the time in the world. Yet he did not despair completely. There was a faint pulse in the egg on his back, a subtle vibration in the sword at his side, a reminder that history and power had not abandoned him entirely. The battlefield was chaos, the losses mounting, the dead advancing, but even as formations crumbled and fallback lines jammed, Jon knew this moment was a prelude, a test of endurance, of patience, of everything the living could muster before the first spark of hope, the awakening of fire that had yet to come. The Night King advanced. The cold deepened and the living fractured, but Jon Snow, standing in the heart of the storm, gripping sword and egg, refused to let the line collapse entirely. Not yet. Chapter 69, The Queen's Fury. The battlefield shivered under Daenerys' wrath. Smoke and ice mixed, fire licking at frozen ground while the winds whipped around her. Her dragons roared, a chorus of fury and desperation, but even they faltered. One of her dragons lay still, wings splayed in a pool of frozen flame. Another stumbled, scales cracked, breath ragged, able only to breathe fire in short, jagged bursts. Only the largest, oldest dragon bore its rider with grim endurance, moving steadily but tiring with every beat of its wings. Daenerys' grief became rage. Every step she took was fire and storm combined, her eyes bright with determination and loss. She swept forward, cutting across the frozen plain with unmatched speed, her voice a command to the Reimagined itself. Behind her, soldiers faltered and fled, and yet she did not see them. She only saw the Night King. The enemy's aura shifted, a pulse of ice and silence that seemed to absorb light. Daenerys lunged, fire trailing from dragon and hand alike, but an invisible force slammed into her chest. She was lifted, thrown, tumbling across the snow, her armor scratched and bent, her breath hitched as she hit the ground hard. The weight of the Night King's magic pressed upon her like a mountain, and for the first time in her life, power felt small, insufficient. From the chaos, Jon saw her thrown aside. Without thinking, without hesitation, he charged across the battlefield. His sword in hand, the egg strapped to his back, he cut through the dead, through falling debris and snow, toward her. His heart pounded not with fear of the dead, but with the knowledge that she could not survive alone. The Night King's gaze turned. Magic struck Jon before he could reach her. Brutal, precise, a force that seemed to pull at flesh and bone. He crumpled to the snow, a shudder running through him, the taste of iron and cold filling his mouth. Pain lanced through every limb, but his mind remained sharp, frantic for survival and for Daenerys. The battlefield felt impossibly large, the enemy endless, the living staggering beneath the weight of inevitability. Daenerys struggled to rise, fury burning in her veins, eyes locked on the Night King. Her remaining dragon fought desperately, smoke curling from cracked scales, beating its wings against the storm, but the sense of loss, of failure, pressed on her. Every strike she attempted was met with cold precision. She could feel the magnitude of what they faced, and the weight of loss bore down, heavier than any crown, heavier than any army. Jon crawled, blood mixing with snow, determined to reach her, while the Night King's army advanced steadily, unhurried, relentless. In that moment, fire and blood, ice and steel, collided, not victory, not defeat, only the edge of a storm yet to be decided. Chapter 70, The Egg. Jon hit the snow hard. Cold bit through armor, pain flared through every tendon, but his mind remained taut, alert even as strength abandoned him. The Night King's magic had cut deep, and the world wavered at the edges of vision, white and blue, fire and frost merging into a blur. The chest strap loosened. The ancient egg slipped from his back, rolling across frozen ground. A spark of light flickered as the Night King's magic brushed it, and the air around the fragment seemed to pulse. Jon's own blood, dripping from wounds across his hands and face, seeped onto the smooth shell. The egg shuddered, subtle at first, then violently, as if sensing both pain and power simultaneously. Cracks spread, delicate and precise, lines like veins across its surface. The chill of death around the battlefield was swallowed by a rising warmth, a heartbeat impossible to measure, a pulse older than any living memory. A sound unlike any roar erupted. It started low, trembling, questioning, then rolled into the sky, filling every valley, every crater, every silent corner of the battlefield with presence. The dragon emerged, not a hatchling, not a child of fire, but a colossal being whose scales shimmered like night pierced by molten veins. Eyes opened, gold and molten, reflecting pain, loss, memory. Jon felt it first in his chest. A pull, a pulse, a voice that was not a voice but a thought, coiling around his mind. The dragon was confused, disoriented, sensing an absence, a void where a rider should have been. Memories flooded him, not Jon's, not now, but of another rider, centuries past. That rider had wielded the sword he now carried, had faced the Night King once before, had fallen, the dragon remembered, felt grief, rage, the echo of fire and blood. Jon's fading consciousness brushed against it. He reached out, not with words, not with magic, but with the simplest clarity of thought. Danger, enemy, living, the dragon responded. Hesitation lingering, fear lingering, but understanding growing. Jon's injuries throbbed, yet he remained the anchor in the storm, the constant presence the beast needed. A spark of recognition passed between them. The dragon sensed the essence of the sword, felt the connection of Jon's blood mingling with ancient power. The memories embedded in the blade whispered of past victories and failures, of strategies that succeeded and those that faltered. Jon did not need to speak. Thought met thought. Pain met memory. Strategy met instinct. The dragon's wings unfolded. Shadows cast across snow and fire, massive wings that blocked the sun, the moon, the stars. Ice crackled where the Night King's power touched. Fire flared from scales, not merely as weapon but as announcement, a presence reborn, ancient and mighty. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jon attempted to rise. Pain screamed through limbs. Yet the dragon nudged him gently, lifting him onto its massive back with uncanny precision. The two became a single force. Human determination, and ancient, awakened instinct. Jon could feel the dragon's confusion turning into resolve, fear giving way to recognition of the threat that mirrored its own old battles. The army below faltered, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the sight. Flames licked the sky, mixed with frost winds, turning the battlefield into a shifting tapestry of heat and cold, life and death. Snow twisted around fire, shadows of the dead retreated slightly, sensing power beyond reckoning. Jon clutched the sword. Now, more than steel, more than memory. The dragon's mind resonated with his, and for the first time since the army had gathered, he felt something other than despair, potential. Not certainty, not victory, but the weight of change, the turning of a tide that had seemed unstoppable. The dragon flexed, massive claws digging into ice and stone, wings catching updrafts with terrifying strength. Jon's mind sharpened, despite wounds, despite exhaustion. He felt, in fragments, The ancient strategies of the previous writer, flashes of how to confront the Night King where weakness had once existed, what had failed, and then they rose together, slicing through snow and storm, a pair born of necessity, of fate, of fire and blood. Eyes met, thought. The world below was chaos. Above, the sky burned. Chapter 71, War Reignited. The battlefield groaned beneath the weight of the living and the dead. Snow and ash swirled together, a gray storm that made every shape indistinct. Jon clung to the saddle, muscles screaming, wounds burning with every movement, yet he remained upright. The dragon beneath him roared, wings beating storms into the frozen air. The creature's scales glinted like smelted iron against the pale, flickering light, reflecting both fire and ice, as though the battlefield itself could not decide which force should dominate. Below, chaos unfolded in cold, disciplined layers. The living struggled to maintain order, but for every shield raised, for every arrow loosed, the dead advanced, unyielding, unmoved by pain, hunger, or death. Snow crunched beneath boots, flames licked the air, and in between, the sounds of broken bones, snapping wood, and shouts of commanders pierced the wind. Jon could see everything, yet he could control nothing, but atop the dragon, he at least had leverage. The dragon resisted the Night King's magic. Blue frost lashed at its wings, ice forming instantly on the edges of scales, but the creature flexed, shaking off the paralysis, rearing and slicing through the frigid currents with raw power. Jon felt the shiver of its confusion, the memories of another battle etched into its essence. He guided it with precise thought, not commands. They moved as one. Air war erupted, flames roared against frost, fire met ice in arcs that twisted the snow into spirals of white and orange. Every strike cost effort. Every breath burned. Yet still the dead advanced, their coordination perfect, movements unnervingly calm. No fear, no hesitation, no fatigue. Stalemate stretched across the plains like a frozen wound. Jon glanced downward. Soldiers fell in piles, yet others stepped into place. Leaders were gone, replaced by others in seconds. The living adapted, but each adaptation was temporary. Every new line of defense meant another line would break elsewhere. Exhaustion was visible on every face. The cold gnawed at morale, yet they did not stop, because stopping meant death. On the horizon, the Night King advanced slowly, spectral and inevitable. His army did not shout, did not cheer, did not surge. It simply moved. The dead's movements were methodical, as if they were aware that time was theirs to command. Jon's heart pounded. He clutched the sword, feeling the hum of power through it, and thought of the egg, now strapped tightly to his chest. Its heat pulsed faintly against his ribs, a reminder that there was something still dormant, something that could shift the balance. He dodged magical strikes, breathed fire bursts alongside his dragon, and even in this chaos, felt the pattern. The dead did not tire. The living could not hope to exhaust them. Every retreat was temporary, every counterattack brief. A hush settled over Jon as he realized this was no battle that could be won with courage or valor alone. Survival depended on knowledge, patience, and awakening forces that had slept for centuries. Chapter 72, The Memory in the Blade. The next strike hit Jon squarely. Pain erupted from his chest, through the sword, into his arms. He fell from the dragon's back, sliding across frozen ground. Darkness swelled at the edges of vision. Then came the pull. A strange sensation, as if the sword itself had claimed him. He fell into memory. Not dream, not hallucination, but a living recording. He saw the original wielder of the sword, a man of stern features, scarred and deliberate. The battlefield was older, snow-streaked, winds like knives cutting through armored men. The Night King moved then as now, calm, precise, unfeeling, and vast beyond measure. The wielder struck, steel met dark magic, but Jon saw the hesitation. The mistiming, the strike that grazed, that wounded, but did not destroy. The dead swept forward, relentless, and the rider fell before he could finish the strike. Jon's mind absorbed every motion, every beat of strategy, every instinct embedded in the metal. The sword carried more than memory. It carried analysis, intuition, lessons carved into essence, waiting for the next hand that could comprehend them. He watched the original attempt, noting where power faltered, where death could have been avoided, Partial damage scattered the Night King, but did not destroy him. The pattern repeated, the heart had to be pierced entirely. Any attempt short of that left fragments of the enemy alive, waiting to regroup. Jon felt his own injuries echoing in memory, the sword hum vibrating through his veins, reminding him of its age, its purpose, its imperative. Every thought connected how the wielder had faltered, what misjudgments had cost lives, and crucially, what must be done next. The vision faded. Pain returned in full force. Jon gasped for breath. The world snapping back into white chaos, the dragons circling overhead, roaring at the dead, flames scattering frost, but not stopping it. He remembered each detail, the timing of strikes, the angles, the vulnerabilities, the ways magic and steel interact, the sequence necessary to pierce the Night King's heart completely. Jon's eyes opened fully. He could see the battlefield with new clarity. The living were exhausted, scattered, but now he knew the method, the exact requirement to end the nightmare. His body trembled, torn and bloody, yet knowledge had sharpened his mind. The sword in his hands was no longer mere steel. It was a guide, a map, a teacher. He rose with effort. Each movement was agony, each breath a battle, yet resolve set like iron. He could finish what had begun centuries before. The dead could be defeated. The Night King destroyed. Not by hope, not by sheer force, but by precision, patience, and the unbroken will to strike true. Above, the dragon circled, massive and alert. Jon felt its mind seeking his, hungry for direction, for purpose. He met it with clarity. We fight, together now, and we endure. The living's line below was frayed, but now there was a plan. The sword had spoken. Jon had listened, and for the first time in weeks, amidst fire, snow, and death, he could see the path forward. Chapter 73, The Last Strike. The battlefield was a frozen canvas of chaos, the air thick with smoke, ash, and frost. Jon moved as if part shadow, part steel, weaving through collapsed tents, broken wagons, and fallen soldiers. Each breath burned, each heartbeat threatened to betray him, yet he remained methodical. The dragon beneath him, massive and ancient, circled above, wings slicing through snow-laden wind, casting fleeting shadows on the ground where the living and the dead collided in endless struggle. Jon could not rely on brute force. He could not charge, could not rally, could not meet the Night King openly. The dead's advance was relentless, their coordination unbroken. Every step forward was met with measured perfection. Flames from dragons scorched ice and snow, but faltered against cold that was older than fire itself. Instead, he used what the living often neglected: patience, calculation, and terrain. Every ridge, every frozen mound, every crater became a tool. The dead moved with certainty, but not adaptability. He drew them in the choke points, into narrow gaps where numbers could be mitigated, distractions multiplied. The dragon's roar above and bursts of fire forced splits in the enemy ranks. Snow and ash, tossed into the air, masked his movements. He crept between frozen carcasses, the sword humming faintly in his grip, resonating with the knowledge it had gifted him. Every strike, every step, every decision was measured. Jon felt the memory of the original wielder guiding him, whispering which angles were fatal, which openings could be exploited. The Night King's form loomed ahead, cold perfection itself, impossibly patient, surveying the battlefield like a god of frost. Jon's pulse steadied. He waited. He watched. He calculated. Then came the moment, a fraction of hesitation, a ripple in the cold calm. Jon's body moved as if no longer his own, the sword guided by both memory and instinct. He lunged, ducking beneath shadows, ignoring fire and shards of ice. The blade pierced the Night King's chest entirely, deep into the core of essence that had lasted centuries. Time seemed to shatter. The dead faltered, stopped, then collapsed in an avalanche of motionless bodies. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. Snow fell softly on their frozen forms, as if the world itself exhaled. Jon, exhausted, wounded, and drained, sank to the ground. Darkness claimed him quickly, his mind slipping into unconsciousness. Above him, the dragon shifted, circling protectively, wings wide against the gray sky. It lowered its massive head, nudging Jon gently with scaled snout, guarding him from stray threats, ensuring the rider who had awakened it would survive the immediate aftermath. Chapter 74, The cost of survival. The world did not cheer. It could not. The war was over, but its toll was staggering. Entire banners had been lost, familiar houses shattered, forests burned to black, rivers frozen and swollen with snowmelt, villages abandoned. Westeros had survived, barely, and the living's victory felt brittle. Jon's name passed through every court and camp, whispered with reverence, fear, and disbelief. The boy who rode the dragon, the boy who struck the Night King. Stories grew with every telling. Rumors of Targaryen blood circulated alongside tales of a dragon newly awakened, larger than any known before, guided by a rider not of the old dynasty, except he was. Daenerys observed from afar. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, weighed the man she had just seen vanish into unconsciousness on the battlefield. One dragon had died, fallen beneath ice and sword, one injured, its fire diminished, but still alive, a shadow of former might, and one untouched, still capable, yet wary, her own grief mingled with awe. This was no ordinary victory, this was something ancient, something new. Reports of the living's losses arrived piecemeal, families destroyed, nobles gone, scouts never returning, wildlings counted in fragments. Victory was not celebration. It was survival. Yet, Jon, unconscious, was the nexus of hope. Whispers of his lineage began to rise. Targaryen blood, hidden by the shadows of history, now paired with deeds that surpassed expectations, challenged even the oldest suspicions. The dragon curled around Jon's prone form, scales glittering faintly with residual magic from the Night King. Every flicker of flame from its nostrils reminded the soldiers below that the war had been won not by army alone, but by a confluence of courage, ancient artifacts, and forces that no one could fully comprehend. Daenerys allowed herself a long silence, acknowledging both loss and achievement. She mourned, yet did not act rashly. The battlefield had taught her that fire alone was insufficient, that power without strategy could be meaningless. Jon's survival, fragile as it was, demonstrated that intellect, patience, and instinct mattered as much as dragons and swords. The realm breathed uneasily. Soldiers returned to their homes. Survivors huddled in tents. Towns began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Yet above the murmurs and grief, a thread of hope persisted. Jon's actions, though not fully understood, had bought the living a chance to endure. And still, Jon slept, held by the dragon's protective presence. Rumors swirled. A dragon rider unlike any other, bearing lineage both hidden and ancient, had changed the course of the world. Westeros waited, silently, for the boy to awaken, and for the choices he would make once he did. The cost was vast. The living had survived. The dead were defeated. But nothing remained untouched by winter's cruelty, nor by the fire of those who had fought to preserve life. Jon, wrapped in sleep and guarded by scales and fire, embodied both the world's fragility and its potential to rise again. Chapter 75, Truth Spoken at Last. Winter still clung to the edges of the north, frost crawling along castle walls and frozen rivers. Rosie arrived at Winterfell, her steps measured, eyes sharp with questions she could not yet ask aloud. She had returned not as a child, nor a wandering shadow, but as a witness to a world transformed, carrying pieces of truth too long concealed. Political tension hung in the halls like mist. Lords whispered behind closed doors, assessing the aftermath of the war that had drained kingdoms and broken armies. Rumors of dragons, of a boy who had wielded a sword older than Valyria, had spread like wildfire, and many questioned what role he would now play in a realm poised between exhaustion and rebuilding. Ned Stark moved carefully, knowing words carried weight, now more than ever. Jon lay unconscious in a private chamber, tended by maesters and shielded by loyal men. The weight of his lineage, his actions, and the recent devastation made any premature declaration dangerous. Yet the realm needed clarity. Arya, sensing her father's hesitation, stepped forward, presenting the first pieces of proof. Old marriage records, carefully preserved, binding Lyanna Stark to Rhaegar Targaryen. The ink had faded, but the seals were unmistakable. Ned spoke quietly, deliberately, his voice steady despite the tremors in his heart. Jon Snow is no longer merely the boy who left Winterfell. He is the true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. His blood binds the north and the south, the living and those who fought against the dead. He laid out additional confirmations, testimonies from witnesses who had attended the secret union, letters sealed by Aemon long ago, and the chest With the dragon egg and sword symbols of a heritage and a responsibility Jon had never sought to wield for power, only for protection. The halls were silent. Servants, soldiers, and minor lords paused mid-step. Even those accustomed to intrigue could not mask the weight of this revelation. This was not a claim shouted from banners or proclamations. It was truth, quiet and immovable, revealed after sacrifice. Jon remained unconscious, the center of attention without voice, an axis around which speculation and hope now spun. No one rushed to claim crowns. No one sought advantage yet. The realm, exhausted and wary, waited. Outside, winter's grip loosened slightly, the sun rising weakly over snow-laden trees, casting light on a kingdom that had survived, just barely, the Dead's March. Yet the living were unsettled. They had seen the price of survival and now faced the weight of lineage, inheritance, and potential anew. Chapter 76. The Truth That Settles Like Ash. The aftermath of Revelation unfolded with measured restraint. Lords gathered quietly in halls, some in Winterfell, others receiving word via Raven. The truth spread not as noise, but as a dense, settling ash, inescapable, tangible, and inescapably heavy. Jon Snow, Jon Targaryen, had not chosen power. He had fought, suffered, and remained silent even as dragons came to him unbidden, and armies bent only to necessity, not obedience. The lords of Westeros absorbed this carefully. This was no boy seeking crowns, but a man who had become the living emblem of survival and responsibility. Proofs were examined repeatedly. Lyanna's marriage documents confirmed legitimacy. Witness testimonies validated the union, and letters from Aemon sealed with the weight of the Citadel's knowledge corroborated both lineage and inheritance. Even those who had doubted the improbable, the arrival of dragons under Jon's command, the victories against the dead, could no longer question the reality. Shocks rippled through the council halls. Some lords previously prepared for intrigue or rebellion found their ambitions tempered. The recognition that Jon had neither sought power nor manipulated history shifted priorities. A new form of respect, cautious yet sincere, emerged among them. Daenerys, observing from her encampment afar, processed the revelation privately. Her initial reaction, curiosity, guarded suspicion, yielded to reflection. Jon had not seized dragons for himself, had not claimed what was his by blood. Instead, he had risked everything and suffered gravely, without voice, without reward. She recognized that in this act, he had preserved the realm, preserved the living, and preserved the fragile hope of order. Jon remained in a deep coma, the stillness of his body contrasting the undercurrent of anxiety and awe surrounding him. The realm waited, watching not a king or queen, but a symbol, a living witness to the cost of survival, the weight of truth, and the possibilities of unity. The theme was clear. Revelation after sacrifice carries gravity, not chaos. The realm did not erupt into power struggles or rebellions. Shock was profound, yet the timing, after Jon had already survived and after the dead had been vanquished, allowed reflection to temper ambition. In the north and beyond, whispers began to circulate. The boy who had defeated the dead, the rider of a dragon, the last link between Stark and Targaryen, had endured, and though silent, he was no longer invisible. His story, his blood, and his deeds had reshaped expectations. As the snow melted slowly, revealing ravaged lands and scarred villages, the living prepared to rebuild. Jon's truth settled across Westeros like ash, dense, silent, unyielding, and yet containing the promise of renewal. The realm had survived winter. Now it confronted a deeper question, how to live in the shadow of truth that demanded acknowledgement without letting ambition consume it. And in the quiet halls of Winterfell, with dragons circling in distant skies, the people waited for the boy who was not a boy, the Targaryen who had never sought the throne, to awaken and guide them through the fragile dawn. Chapter 77. A realm that rebuilds without orders. The winter thawed slowly, exposing scars carved deep into the land. Villages that had once thrived now stood half-ruined, their roofs splintered, fields churned into mud, and roads blocked by debris from both ice and the battle. Yet life persisted. Across Westeros, small folk and minor lords alike began to rebuild, not at the command of a king, nor under the shadow of a queen's immediate authority, but out of necessity, driven by survival, by memory of what had been lost. In the Riverlands, peasants returned to the fields, working together to replant crops that had been trampled during the siege. Soldiers formally aligned with different banners labored side by side, clearing rubble and tending injured livestock. In the Vale, lords shared timber and labor to rebuild broken keeps, negotiating usage of resources without the usual pomp or protocol. Councils met quietly, their authority maintained not through fear or titles, but through consensus and the pressing need to prevent chaos. Winterfell itself became a hub of reconstruction. Robb Stark, steady and unshaken, guided the North's recovery with the calm of one who had seen the worst and chosen to endure. Roads were cleared, walls reinforced, and patrols maintained, not for show, but to protect the vulnerable from remnants of raiders, and the occasional lingering threat of wild creatures emboldened by the devastation. Daenerys contributed without seeking recognition. Her dragons remained in the skies, circling high, only ever summoned for transport of supplies or to deter occasional raiders. Food shipments from the Reach and Dorne arrived under her personal supervision, distributed to towns and villages equally, avoiding preferential treatment. She did not parade her presence. Instead, she became an invisible hand ensuring stability while the realm rebuilt itself. Her restraint impressed the people, who recognized her as a queen tempered by the weight of loss. Even the Great Council functioned, though Jon remained unconscious. Decisions were taken collectively, every major house represented. The absence of a central figure had initially felt destabilizing, but it allowed voices previously silenced to participate meaningfully. Councils determined the repair of castles, allocation of resources, and protection of trade routes, all without any singular will imposing itself. The authority was diffuse but effective, grounded in the memory of the Night King's devastation and the undeniable cost of failure. Stories circulated of Jon Snow, of the boy who had crossed beyond the wall, faced the dead, and survived. He became a symbol not for power, but for action and resilience. Parents told their children of the man who had ridden a dragon against an enemy no army could count. Rumors of his awakening reached villages even before it occurred. Though unconfirmed, they filled the people with cautious hope. Daenerys, meanwhile, was remembered differently. She had lost one dragon entirely, another gravely wounded, yet had fought with calculated restraint. Her measured participation in reconstruction reinforced the idea that true power lay not in spectacle, but in the careful, deliberate protection of life. People saw her not as a conqueror, but as a survivor, a protector whose patience could hold a kingdom together. Amid the quiet recovery, the fragile peace held, not through crowns or proclamations, but because the realm had witnessed the consequences of failure. Authority was a shared responsibility, yet at its core was the unspoken understanding. The winter had come, the dead had marched, and survival required unity above ambition. The roads were cleared, crops replanted, keeps fortified. Yet beneath the labor and quiet conversations, an awareness lingered. Peace was not guaranteed. It could be broken. It could falter. But for now, it grew organically, like seedlings pushing through snowmelt, tentative yet resilient. Westeros had learned to move forward without waiting for a crown. Chapter 78, The Wake Without a Corpse. Jon remained unconscious, drifting between the edge of life and the fragile veil of sleep. The castle felt emptier without him awake, though he was physically present. His silence carried the weight of absence. Arya Stark returned fully to Winterfell, no longer wandering the roads as a shadow of herself, but grounded in purpose, standing vigil at her brother's bedside. She did not kneel or speak of crowns. She simply sat, a steady presence, eyes flicking over him as though she could will him back with patience alone. Robb Stark governed the North with unwavering resolve, his leadership born not from ambition but necessity. He ensured that patrols kept to their schedules, supplies reached towns, and the remnants of armies remained disciplined. Yet even with order restored, the Stark siblings could not replace the void that Jon's silence left, nor could they accelerate the slow healing of the realm. Rosier's perspective was quiet, intimate. She did not brood over enemies defeated or victories claimed. She felt anger at fate itself, at the unfairness of the war, the cost of heroism, and the fragility of life. Yet, in the long hours beside her brother, she also discovered acceptance. Heroes, she realized, always pay first. And Jon's sacrifice was both immense and silent. Daenerys visited Winterfell once, approaching without guards, without fanfare. Her presence was a reminder that the living world stretched beyond the North, that she was not there to assert power but to bear witness to what had been endured. She left nothing but a dragon-scale charm on Jon's bed, a small talisman charged with both protection and silent acknowledgement. Her eyes held no accusation, no envy, only reflection, a rare glimpse into the mind of one who had lost as much as she had gained. No council was called during this period. The Great Council remained in waiting, its authority intact but unused, respecting the silence that Jon's condition demanded. No throne was claimed. No ambition overtook mourning or reflection. The realm paused not out of indecision, but because it lacked the presence of the man who had become its pivot. Months passed in the rhythm of quiet vigilance. Lords met, resources moved, roads cleared, and villages repaired. But each day carried a lingering awareness that the heart of Westeros' future remained in stasis. Even as small folk planted crops and repaired homes, they knew that Jon's awakening would recalibrate the balance of power. That one man, comatose yet central, would determine the next chapter of history. Arxaye, observing him daily, came to a profound understanding. She would not let his absence allow despair to dominate. She ensured the halls remained ordered, the children of Winterfell unafraid, and the stories of courage alive. And in those silent hours, the siblings waited, silent guardians over a hero in slumber. Daenerys, though she remained at a distance, understood the delicate equilibrium. She had come to respect that this pause was not weakness, but necessity. The realm had survived chaos, the dead had fallen, and Jon's voice, though silent, was now the axis on which hope turned. Time passed with cautious continuity. Winter loosened its grip, and the first stirrings of spring hinted at renewal. Yet Westeros learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the realm pauses because it does not know how to move forward without one person, and sometimes survival itself is measured in quiet vigilance rather than triumphant cries. Chapter 779, The Man Who Wakes Changed. Jon's first awareness was cold. Not the icy winds beyond the wall, not the frost that had gnawed at the north, but a deep, hollow chill that felt lodged inside his bones. He blinked against the dim light of Castle Black's infirmary, his eyes unsteady on the shapes around him. Shadows shifted along the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and herbs, but beneath that lingered the scent of scorched earth, of dragon fire mingled with decay. He could feel it, the remnants of the battlefield, the echoes of the dead army, the emptiness left by what had nearly consumed them all. For a moment, he could not move. Muscles protested even the lightest twitch. His hands felt alien, thin with weakness, knuckles scraped and stained faintly with old blood. His head throbbed in the rhythm of something remembered, something beyond memory, the Night King, the army of the dead, the searing touch of magic against flesh. Yet they were gone now, dispersed, shattered, but the absence was not peace. It was a vacuum. Beside him, the dragon he had awakened hovered low, immense wings folded. It watched him with quiet intelligence, head tilting, nostrils flaring faintly in the cold air. Its scales caught the wan morning light, reflecting the muted colors of dawn. Larger than any bird or beast he had ever seen, yet still patient. Jon realized immediately. The dragon recognized him, yet it did not bow. It did not demand control. It waited, protective, wary, but distant. A partner not yet fully aligned. He tried to speak, and could only rasp a sound. His throat burned, his voice a fragile thread. But the maesters attending him nodded, understanding that the silence was part of his recovery. Months in a coma had left him not only physically diminished, but mentally raw, the edges of memory frayed by pain and visions, and yet the essential truths remained. The war was over, the dead had fallen, Westeros survived. Jon's gaze shifted to the small window above the infirmary bed. Beyond it, the snow had melted in streaked patterns, revealing patches of earth cracked and scarred, remnants of the battles that had raged across the north. The horizon was quiet now, almost too quiet, yet it held a promise of continuity, a world waiting to be rebuilt. He breathed slowly, testing his lungs, counting each inhalation, each exhalation, the rhythm of life reaffirming itself. A gentle footfall drew his attention. Robb Stark entered, tall and solemn, a presence that reminded Jon of family and duty intertwined. Robb did not kneel. He merely watched Jon, offering neither words of triumph nor pity. Beside him, Arya lingered, silent but steady, her eyes unflinching. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply existed in the room, a witness, a reminder that life continued around him even as he had been suspended in liminality. "Jon," Robb said quietly, voice careful. "You've awakened?" Jon nodded, slow and deliberate, more a confirmation than a greeting. He felt no jubilation, no immediate desire to speak of crowns or allegiances. Those concerns were distant, almost meaningless in the shadow of what had passed. His memories of the battlefield, of dragonfire and the army of the dead weighed heavier than any notion of power. Victory had been earned at a cost so vast that celebration seemed grotesque. "Tell me," Jon whispered, voice cracking, "is the war truly over?" Robb's eyes held him. "It is," he said. "The living stand, the dead have fallen. Westeros survives." Relief passed through Jon. Not as joy, not as triumph, but as recognition of something fragile and profound. Life persisted. Survival was not the same as victory, and yet it was enough for now. The scope of loss, the sheer scale of what had been sacrificed still pressed down on him. Thousands had died. Cities were in ruins. Dragons, once symbols of overwhelming power, were diminished. One lost entirely, another gravely wounded but alive, and the largest, awakened by him, now guarded and wary. Even power had a cost. Jon's eyes drifted toward the dragon, his mind unconsciously scanning its scales, its eyes, its immense wings folded like great panels of shadow. He had awakened it with blood, with magic, with the residue of his own survival. It recognized him as a rider, as a partner, but he had not claimed it. The bond was nascent, fragile, built on necessity rather than domination. It did not roar, it did not demand. It waited, patient and immense, as if understanding that its rider was no longer the same boy who had once crossed the wall. News arrived in fragments, he learned, without anyone pressing, that the realm knew his identity. Lyanna's marriage, his birthright, the legacy of Rhaegar, all were confirmed, displayed openly among the lords and small folk alike. Jon did not feel elation, he did not feel ambition. The knowledge sat beside him quietly, a detail of identity that mattered less than survival and what remained undone. The realm had survived the dead. That, he understood more than any title, was worth everything. Even Daenerys had not moved against him. She had watched from a distance, a dragon rider and queen still, but tempered by loss and recognition. She had survived, as had he, and their dragons existed in the sky as guardians, not symbols of dominion. The balance of power, he realized, was no longer determined by crowns, but by endurance and alliance, by understanding and restraint. Jon tested his legs. Pain lanced through muscles atrophied, through joints stiffened by months of stillness. He breathed through it, counting each motion, each movement, each heartbeat. Recovery would take time, patience, and humility. He would not rush back into politics. Not yet. The Great Council existed, operating in his absence, maintaining order without him, testing his capacity for influence rather than immediate command. In private, Jon thought about what it meant to have finished a duty. Not a mission of glory, not a conquest, not a crown, but a duty that had demanded every ounce of courage, thought, and endurance he possessed. He had faced death, darkness, and the weight of history itself. That he survived did not make him a king. It made him a witness, a guardian, a man changed beyond recognition, tempered by winter, by fire, by the dead. "I do not feel like a king," he whispered to himself. The words were not resignation, nor humility, but acknowledgement. Purpose was not given. It was chosen every day anew in the decisions made in waking, in thought, in patience, in endurance. Survival, he realized, did not carry authority. It carried opportunity and the weight of history on one's shoulders. The dragon lowered its massive head toward him, scales brushing lightly against his arm. Jon reached out instinctively. Their minds brushed for a moment, not speech, but understanding. The dragon had seen war, loss, and death. He had seen the dead army and the Night King's unyielding patience. Together, they were not kings nor rulers, nor weapons. They were guardians, aware of the fragility of life and the persistence of time. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the dragon's presence anchor him. The realm was alive. Westeros was breathing. Fragile, but persistent. Jon understood at last that his purpose would not be dictated by birth, by throne, or by legacy. It would be dictated by the choices he would make from this point onward. And for now, he would listen, recover, and endure. For the dead were gone, and the living remained. Chapter 80. The crown that was refused. The Great Council assembled once more, but not as it had in years past. Castle Black had become too small for such a gathering. Instead, a neutral hall in King's Landing had been chosen, wide and ancient, with stone pillars etched with the memory of old rulers long gone. Lords and ladies of every corner of Westeros had arrived, banners deliberately absent as if to remind themselves that no one person now held dominance. Representatives of smaller folk, merchants and minor knights, filled the side galleries, their voices carrying weight in subtle nods and murmurs. The air was tense, measured, thick with anticipation. Daenerys Targaryen sat prominently, but not regally. She had shed the immediate trappings of conquest. Her dragon rested nearby, restrained yet alert, and she spoke seldom, listening. Her eyes sharp, airing every gesture, every whisper. Her armor bore scars from battles past, but her posture remained imperious. She was still a queen, yet tempered by defeat and reflection. Her loss in survival had carved patience into her spirit. She had lost one dragon entirely, another severely injured and weakened, and the last remained strong, a living symbol of both power and restraint. Jon Snow stood opposite her, not crowned, not heralded. He was still recovering from the months-long coma, his wounds scarred but healing, the new dragon beside him as silent as a shadow. He did not approach as a claimant. He approached as witness and protector, his presence commanding not by right of birth, but by the weight of deeds that had saved Westeros itself. His voice, when he spoke, was low, steady, carrying no arrogance. The meeting began with formalities, though the words were almost ceremonial. Lords presented evidence of their losses, the resources they could commit, and their assessment of the realm's future needs. Some murmured anxiously. Others were quiet, weighing the implications of Jon's survival, his identity, and Daenerys' continued presence. Rumors had already begun spreading. Jon the Targaryen, dragon rider, Daenerys queen by fire and merit, the living victorious but shattered. The council was aware that the past could not be undone, but the future could still be steered. When the question of leadership arose, silence fell heavy across the chamber. Whispers of Jon Snow as king passed cautiously, as if speaking it aloud might disturb the fragile calm. A few voices pressed for Daenerys to ascend by right, but she raised a hand and gestured them to restraint. It was Jon who finally spoke, voice measured, eyes unwavering. "I have fought to end a war, not to begin a reign," he said. "I will not take the Iron Throne. I owe my life and my loyalty to the living, not to a seat of power." Murmurs filled the room, but not in surprise or dissent. There was respect, the understanding that the man who had pierced the Night King's heart and survived held a wisdom beyond the need for crowns. Jon continued, proposing reform. The future of Westeros must not rest on heredity alone. A ruler may sit, yes, but decisions must be guided by the counsel of those who serve the realm. The Great Council shall vote on matters of importance. Power will be checked, its exercise accountable. Those who inherit the throne shall do so with the consent of the living, not by accident of birth. Daenerys listened, expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "I accept," she said. Her tone carried neither submission nor challenge, only recognition of necessity. "I will rule, but I will not rule alone. We are bound by duty, not conquest. By rebuilding together, we honor those we lost." The lords of Westeros exchanged glances. Some were cautious, others relieved. The rule of tradition had been reshaped without bloodshed, yet with acknowledgement of merit and sacrifice. It was a balance forged in fire, ice, and endurance. Jon, standing slightly apart, felt the weight of his new responsibility, head of the Great Council for life. He would guide, advise, arbitrate, but not dictate. Daenerys' rule would be checked, informed, and stabilized by the collective wisdom of the realm. This was not subordination, it was partnership, born of necessity, tempered by the scars of war. Outside, the sky above King's Landing bore witness. 3 dragons soared, one great and awakened through Jon's sacrifice, immense and gleaming with scales like molten stone, one of Daenerys's that had survived the carnage, scarred yet fierce, and the last, a reminder of loss, circling silently as if honoring those who had fallen. Their shadows fell upon the council hall, a visual testament to the union of fire and the living. Jon watched them, feeling both awe and clarity. This era would be different. No single ruler would wield absolute power. No one would act unchecked. The Great Council would remain, representing every corner of Westeros, empowered by accountability, guided by those who had survived to speak. And though Jon would never claim a throne, his life would be defined not by crowns, but by choices made in the stead of necessity and honor. The council rose as one to formally acknowledge the decisions. Daenerys' acceptance was not a surrender, but a recognition of the realm's fragile needs. Jon's refusal of kingship was met not with protest, but with respect. He had ended the dead, he had endured the fire, and he had guided Westeros to a new way forward. Outside, the dragons circled higher, the wind beneath their wings stirring the clouds. The three living, breathing reminders of sacrifice, resilience, and continuity moved as one over the ruined but recovering city. Fire and frost, past and future, strength and restraint. They were a signal to the realm that a new age had begun. One without unquestioned authority, yet with hope grounded in shared responsibility. Jon, for the first time in months, allowed himself to breathe fully, leaning on the warmth of the dragon at his side. Westeros had survived the dead. Power had been tempered by wisdom, and above all, choice, conscious, deliberate, and accountable, would shape the generations to come. The final image lingered in the minds of all who witnessed that council. 3 dragons in the sky. 2 born of fire, 1 awakened through sacrifice, a silent testament to the endurance of the living, the prudence of the wise, and the promise of a realm rebuilt not by fear, but by understanding.
Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed this reimagined story and audiobook style presentation, feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this. New stories and alternate scenarios are updated regularly. Now see you in the next video.